Last year, I ended up reading 60 books, and only 3 of them were in my native language, while the rest were in English, Italian, Spanish, and German. And today I thought I'd share this very simple system that allows me to read in all these languages. What you want to do essentially is play with 3 parameters, which are content, format, and prior knowledge on the topic. So content basically corresponds to how difficult the material that you're reading is. Of course, if you're a beginner, anything is going to be difficult, but it's also true that there are some books that are objectively harder than other books. These are the ones you have to stay away from, at least for the time being. I know that for me, for example, a novel written in a very flowery language is going to be harder compared to, say, a self-help book. Reading a book that was written in the last 10 years is usually much easier than reading a book that was written, say, 150 years ago, although that's not always the case. Reading most children's books is also going to be easier than reading, let's say, Crime and Punishment. I think you get the idea. So what we want to do here is go down in terms of difficulty and then slowly increase difficulty as you get better. I usually start with graded readers that are written specifically for language learners. I will read a couple or a couple dozen, depends on the language really, and then I move on to children's books or maybe short stories or graphic novels, whatever feels like a little bit of a challenge but still doable. And of course, the more you read, the closer you will be to the point where you can read most things that you want. So the next parameter is format, or how the information is presented to you. Here we need to make sure, especially in the very beginning, that the format you're reading in makes the job easy, or at least does not make it more difficult. For example, if you're reading a physical book and you have to look up every single word that you do not know manually, that can get pretty tiring pretty quick. On the other hand, reading on an e-reader or maybe a tablet where you can look up words and translate sentences in just a couple of clicks is a lot more doable. Listening to an audiobook when your listening skills are still lacking, so apart from not knowing some words, you sometimes can't even hear the ones that you do know, that is difficult. Going through a written text where you can clearly see every single word and supplementing it with an audiobook is a lot easier. Reading pages and pages of text is difficult. Reading the graphic novel and using the illustrations as visual cues to help you understand the plot, or maybe even going through the book sentence by sentence, that's a lot more doable. And again, there are so many ways to make the task easier for yourself. You can read an abridged version instead of the original. You can also read digitally to be able to increase font size for languages like Arabic or Japanese if that's something that you feel you need. Sometimes you have to get creative with it, but there are many ways to use formatting to make the process easier for yourself. And then finally, something that's going to be your friend is your background knowledge. Basically, that's anything that you already know that will also make reading easier. To give the most basic example, the higher your level is in the language, or the more knowledge you have of vocabulary and grammar, the easier it's going to be to read across a variety of genres and formats. But thankfully, it doesn't stop there. For example, reading a book that you've already read in your mother tongue is going to make it easier. And this is actually one of the most popular tips about reading in other languages. And as much as I personally don't always like rereading books, I have tried it myself and I can confirm that it actually works. Reading about a topic that you are already familiar with is also going to be very helpful. And I feel like this one is maybe not being talked about as much, but I encourage you to pick a topic that you're knowledgeable about and then try reading about this topic in your target language. And I'm sure you'll be surprised at how much more you can understand compared to a topic that you know nothing about. So there you have it. 3 parameters that you can play with to make reading more doable, even as a beginner. If you're reading something more difficult, see if you can read it digitally. Use tools like Link. That's what I've been using throughout this video. Or Readline is another popular one. If you want to listen to an audiobook in your target language, then maybe you can start with a book that you've already read or listened to before. And here are some more examples that are actually taken from my own experience. As somewhat of an advanced beginner in German who's also tired of children's books and graded readers at this point, I'm currently trying to start reading novels. And this means that I am going up in terms of difficulty. So I choose novels that are shorter, that are action-packed, as opposed to novels that maybe focus on character development. And I will read them using Link, an app that allows me to go at it sentence by sentence, translating unknown words and difficult phrases. On the other hand, as a pretty advanced reader in Italian, I am now at a stage where I'm very comfortable reading using my e-reader. Again, it makes looking up words so easy. But I've been trying to push myself to read more physical books. And even with my current level of Italian, I still have to be somewhat picky. A novel from the 20th century? Sure, why not? I've read a bunch of those. A book written in the 14th century? I think that one will have to wait a bit, and when I do get it, I'll make sure I read it digitally and maybe even find an adaptation in modern Italian as opposed to whatever version or dialect it was written in. But one last thing I wanted to mention here is that motivation is another huge factor. And even if we consider all of the parameters that I've mentioned here, reading can and most likely will still be challenging. This system that I have described is pretty straightforward, but getting to a level where you can read whatever you want is not going to be easy, I can't promise you that. But what often drives me forward is my desire to be able to read books in a certain language. And because of that, sometimes, but not too often, I will go for a book or a format that I know I will struggle with, just because I think reading this particular thing is going to be worth the struggle. I would not recommend doing that with every single book that you read. So generally, I do think that following the principles that I've just described is beneficial. And this is pretty much it. Let me know if you too love reading in other languages, and if so, which ones are you able to read in or maybe trying to read in? As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye bye!